Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. So inshallah we begin a new series of reflections, and we're starting with a reflection on the Quran itself in the shade of the Quran, and it's part of the Dawah series. But before we go into that, we want to make sure that we have an understanding that engaging the Quran is one of the most important things that we can do, not only in the issue of da'wah, but also when it comes to understanding the deen itself. Specifically, when we talk about this masjid, talk about Sheikh Muhammad uh, as the leading imam here. One of the things that we find in specific with regards to how he teaches is that the Quran has its supremacy. That doesn't negate the role of the Sunnah, but what has happened is that we like to talk about how it was that the Sahaba practiced. That's a common feature that we hear everybody talk about, how the Sahaba practiced, that we should follow the Sahaba. But when we look at the actual methodology, we see a clash and a difference. The Sahaba themselves, they were reared primarily on the Quran, and the Prophet ﷺ was a living example. So some of the scholars, they like to say that the Sunnah in this case is an indication of how to implement the Quran. But what has happened is that wisdom, which some like Imam Shafi'i have interpreted the Sunnah to be wisdom, meaning to put things in its proper place, is somewhat lost. And so we have gotten caught up into what does this hadith mean and what does that hadith mean, and we argue about a hadith and who's practicing the hadith, and in reality we've lost the centrality of the Quran. That's almost undebatable. Even some years ago, it's probably been about 10, 15 years ago, one of the scholars in Saudi admitted, and he said that you can find the class here on Aqidah, you can find the class here on Hadith, you can find a class here on a number of different topics, but when it comes to the issue of the study of the Quran, and he was talking about Saudi itself, this is an environment in which the Quran was revealed. Mm-hmm. And this is Sheikh Abdullah al-Khudair, Dr. Abdullah al-Khudair. And he says, but you rarely find this. You rarely find a circle in which the Quran is actually being studied. Now things have changed quite a bit, but the reality is that there was a whole series of generations, about two generations or so, maybe 2.5, that were reared on this idea of just pushing a hadith, and it ended us in a really bad place, because the spirit of the Quran, the principles of the Quran, were not set as the foundation. That has to be set as the foundation first. And when we talk about tafsir of the Quran, one of the most fundamental and most important types of tafsir is the Quran explaining itself, not the Quran being explained by anything else, but the Quran being explained by itself. And for some people, they don't like that. You understand what I'm saying? They don't like that because they want to do away with the whole process that we have to do work in Dawah. We can't just imitate what is happening in another country or what happened in another time period. It's not going to work. It doesn't work. And that's why one of the reasons we see so much difficulties in our community, in people's lives, and the struggle is because of this reality. Like we have this, like we're not live. Like I never forget, some years back, a brother told me, he said, I was not educated, and this was a brother that was born here. He said, I was not educated to be a Muslim in America. I was educated to be a Muslim like I'm living in another country, right? And this was a person that was born here, his grandparents were born here, and that shows the major disconnect that we have. And so at first, it seems as though that's going to give us strength because it's us against everybody else. You know what I'm saying? Because it's like we have to maintain our identity. But that shell holds up only so long before life, like like Dr. Muhammad Hatem says, life, when life begins to speak on life's terms. Then when life comes on its own terms and we encounter all kind of struggles, then all of a sudden we're like, well, why isn't this working? You know what I'm saying? I'm praying, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Why is it not working for me? And then that's when we begin to realize that we're just like everyone else. We have shahada, but that doesn't mean that we're absolved, or that doesn't mean that we're necessarily protected from the same struggles that the society is going through. So then the questions start to come up. Well, now how does Islam relate to my life? Right? Because somewhere along the line, I'm missing in this. Like now I need to figure out how Islam speaks to my situation. And so what we find is that that's how the Quran addressed the situations of the early generation. The Quran was speaking to them in their life situations gradually. That's why we keep mentioning this, that it was speaking gradually, right, to the people. It wasn't demanding or commanding them to change overnight, and not even society to change overnight. And this is part of the struggle that we have, that we want people to change overnight, right? And we want the society to conform to us. Sometimes, like you hear this. Sometimes you hear this very clearly when it comes to the politics. Like for instance, when Ilhan Omar, when she was running, not that we necessarily have to agree with her or disagree with her, but just as an example, people felt as though they were like, we put her in office. You know what I'm saying? They Muslims literally felt that they put her in office, and they felt that the way that she should, now she's a politician, she's a Muslim, she's representing the Muslim community. She has to be in the White House telling them what Islam is and implementing Islam in that reality on their terms, not even on the terms that maybe Islam may guide, in that process, but on their terms. And that is the mentality that we have. Like we have a mindset that we say in the Quran, la ikraha fi din. We say there's no compulsion, right? And there's no obligating, especially when we start talking about non-Muslims in the issue of religion. Like we're especially when it comes to the issue of non-Muslims, obligating others to believe what we believe and to practice what we practice. And we say, oh yeah, Islam doesn't impose, but in reality we start to impose. And we see that in the issue of Dawah. We see when people come into our community, sometimes they're not Muslim. The first thing they're asked about hijab, especially when it comes to sisters. And you come to find out they're not even women. They are Muslim. You understand what I'm saying? They're women that are maybe Christian. They're women that may believe in something else. So we immediately go to that mindset. And we don't realize that it's not only an issue of deen. We don't realize that also that's a form of discrimination. You see what I'm saying? Because now people are coming into our environment and we're trying to force them into certain practices that necessarily are not their practices. That's one thing, like if they have bad behavior and all that. That's something different. But to force them into hijab, to force them, you can tell them, yeah, we have a dress code, at a basic level, but that's not how we should deal with the non-Muslims. And it's the same thing when we find that people are coming into the deen as youth, or they're coming into the deen as adults, or they're struggling with Islam. There's no way. And we keep mentioning that over and over again because we've seen it. We've seen it over a few decades, and we've seen that people have lost themselves. So the centrality of the Quran is important. So when we talk about the characteristics of the Muslim, we have about 10 characteristics that we can build off of that serve as a curriculum, right? And the first one is that the Muslim should have a sound belief. And so what we're doing here is that we're trying to gain that sound belief by way of the Quran. Why? Because Muslims have made issues of belief, issues of what we call aqidah, points of debate. And that's not the point of belief. The point of belief is not to stay stuck in debating with different groups. We need to benefit from that belief so that we can rely upon it in our lives, so that it can be a source of guidance for us, not to debate about whether this person believes like I believe, or this group is right or this group is wrong. Islam is not that confused. You understand what I'm saying? There's enough teachings in Islam that are fundamental, that are clear, that are foundational, that are essential for anybody to be able to take just that basic stuff, to be able to practice, to be able to grow. And it's something that's held in common, that there's not really debates, on these issues. So then after that is the issue of, having sound ibadah or having sound worship. Like, and in this case, we're talking about something simple for the moment. At least understanding the soundness of your salah. And we're going to come back to the issue of the Quran, but we're just going over these 10 characteristics of some of the goals that we would like to reach when it comes to the issue of developing ourselves, and also how it is that we talk about the da'wah. So what are some of the priorities? And so when we talk about these 10 characteristics, we're talking about the qualities of the Muslims, certain areas that they should work on, right? And so what better place than to get to know what Islam is than the Quran itself, at a basic level. And then the issue of correcting our basic acts of worship like salah, and realizing, like, even when it comes to other things like marriage, when it comes to economics and so on and so forth, that those are things that we should have some general guidelines. And that's a discussion in and of itself. Like, how do we begin to learn those things in this type of society? Because that's another issue that comes up, that we're trying to enforce certain practices and ideas that in reality it took the Muslim community, at least in the early generation, at least almost a quarter of a century, 25 years to be able to implement that. So we want, like, for instance, with the issue of riba, we say the issue of interest is haram. But it took about 25 years of Quranic education and building a community that was able to handle implementing that teaching together. You see what I'm saying? Now we're asking people to do that as individuals. And some of these things are not practical. Like, for instance, everyone in this society, for the most part, has to have some sort of credit in order to get an apartment, or else you're just in the holes. To rent a car, if you need to travel one place to another, to get a plane ticket, you know what I'm saying? Yes, you can get away with having a debit card, but only so far. So then the issue becomes that even on the issue of credit cards, we're dealing with the issue of school loans. School loans is another problem. You understand what I'm saying? Housing. When you look at, we have a problem overall with housing in multiple directions nowadays. But, what do you do with the issue of housing? You know what I'm saying? What do you do with the issue of getting a mortgage? There's a lot of things the same thing with insurance, car insurance, health insurance. These things are riba based. You know what I'm saying? And so we have discussions sometimes that are not discussions that are related to the reality that we're dealing with. And what we try to do is we try to jump around it rather than talking about what is before us. We aren't in a Muslim society, which is governed by Muslim institutions. Right. You understand what I'm saying? In a place that has an economic set of values that is just totally by Islam. So we have to learn how to navigate in the situations that we're in, and we have to realize that, unfortunately, some things can't be done unless you have a group effort to really make them happen. So ibadah is not just the issue of salah, and it's not just the issue of dhikr, or it's not just the issue of recitation of the Quran, but ibadah has to do also with our social life. The rights that we have on each other, the issue of marriage, how to function in marriage. It's not just the issue of rules as well. That's something that this past Ramadan, we were trying to emphasize that heavily in our Ramadan teachings, was that really what we need to be looking at when we talk about ibadah or worship, we need to be looking at the objectives of what we're trying to aim at. The rules, sometimes they flex and sometimes they don't, but without realizing the objectives of why is it that we're doing salah? Why is it that Islam is legislating zakat? Why is it, that Islam is asking us, to engage in certain practices? Without understanding the whys, especially in this time period, in this society, there's a lot of emphasis put on hear and obey, just listen, just do. But then people after a while, they're like, their minds are not engaged. They're like, I don't even understand why I'm doing this, and not to mention the fact that certain things people are doing them, and they don't even understand things that they're saying, like salah as an example. Many people are praying salah, and they may have memorized some of the Quran, but they don't even know what the meaning is. So then it's a double hit. You're asking people listen and obey, but they don't even know what they're saying, and then they don't know why they're doing what they're doing. So that's especially for youth and especially for converts, that's a big problem. You know what I'm saying? And even for Muslims overall, it's a big problem. But those two groups, are groups that are pretty much learning in the English language. It's not like they're, learning in the Arabic language, which gives them a little more access to other things. But in general, the whole ummah is suffering from that problem of we're just listening. We take the role of sami'na wa ata'na, we listen and we obey, but then we don't understand why it is that we're doing what we're doing. And that has led people to not implement the deen properly. And then what has happened is it has caused a lot of doubt, because sometimes people, they begin to blame Islam when it's not really Islam. It's really the way that we have taught Islam, or the way that we're practicing Islam, and people begin to blame Islam itself because of how it is that the negatives of the way that they were practicing or believing have impacted their lives. So they leave, or they doubt, or they just disengage. They may not necessarily leave, but they disengage. And so knowing why it is that we're doing what we're doing is important. You know what I'm saying? It's key, because it gives us a sense of direction. What are we aiming at? What are we aiming at, and what's the wisdom behind it? And of course, there's some occasions in which there's some difficulty to have an understanding of everything, of all of the wisdom that is there behind what it is that Islam legislates. But in general, we can understand, even if in details we may not understand it. So from there we learned that Islam has objectives. It has 6 major objectives, and there's not necessarily an order in these according to the most soundest position amongst the scholars. But Islam comes to preserve revelation itself, the deen itself. And so Islam is not something, it's not going to legislate to contradict itself. You understand what I'm saying? So the deen, part of the deen is that the belief system and practice and the principles of practice, they're preserved, and the way that it is that Islam teaches is to preserve those things. And that has a little more discussion. And then there's, preservation of life. And of course, we could have put that one in the beginning. Preservation of life is of the utmost important in terms of Islam. Preservation of intellect, our minds. It's not just from, that's why you find, for instance, preservation of life, that's why you find that murder is something that is prohibited. But it's not just preservation of life, it's also developing life and cultivating life, celebrating life. That's important. You understand what I'm saying? Because the human being, like we mentioned, and we were talking about this point in some of the classes in the past, and many times we're talking about religion without the human being. We've forgotten to deal with the human being at the human level. And that means that we're lacking in compassion and empathy and mercy and so on and so forth. Matter of fact, some people, when you bring up those terms, mercy, forgiveness, empathy, it's just like, that's some Christian stuff.
I don't want to hear that.
We don't want to hear that. That's Christian stuff. Although the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was described by Allah tabarak wa ta'ala as rahmatan lil alameen, as a mercy. Although, and we're going to cover in a few minutes, in Surah Al-Fatiha, we see the repetition of Allah tabarak wa ta'ala described as the most merciful, the most compassionate. And in every chapter of the Quran, with the exception of Surah Al-Tawbah, and even if we were to say Surah Al-Anfal and Surah Al-Tawbah are one, some scholars had that opinion, that would mean that every chapter of the Quran begins with Allah is the most merciful, the most compassionate. Some scholars say that Surah Al-Fatiha was the first to be revealed of the Quran. We don't know exactly with every detail what was the first, what came after. We have some general ideas. So sometimes there's differences of opinion. Some scholars say Surah Al-Alaq this, the chapter, the Qlat, in which the Prophet ﷺ is commanded to read. Some say that was the first to be revealed. Some say Surah Al-Fatiha was the first to be revealed. I was going by the other opinion for some time, and then this opinion is there. So then, if Surah Al-Fatiha was the first to be revealed, so then that means that the first thing Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is presenting is read, or Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. And so Allah is introducing who Allah is in that framework of compassion and mercy. And even if we were to say Surah Al-Alaq was the first to be revealed, then the same thing is coming, that read in the name of your Rabb, and the term Rabb is a very beautiful term, that it's talking about Allah as the one that creates, the one that sustains, the one that guides. You see, is a very beautiful, very soft introduction to who Allah is. And so, and then on top of that, the Quran is commanding us to read. The Quran is commanding us to read and to think and to reflect. And so the first thing, like we said, of the characteristics of the Muslim is to have a sound belief. And we said that, we get the fundamentals of that belief from the Quran itself. And then the second thing is that we should be working to understand how to worship. And we said that what is key here is understanding that worship overall, or ibadah overall, it has different dimensions. It's not just salah, it's not just reciting of the Quran, but it includes life overall. Business dealings, marriage, everything like that, raising children, and there's objectives and all that. And then the third quality that the Muslim develops is to have a firm and sound character. And this is a big issue, because character, or a good disposition, or more than just good manners, is just having values in the way that we carry ourselves, the way we deal with ourselves, and the way we deal with other people. This is something that a lot of times, when we call husn al-khuluq, or good character, a lot of times we find that people don't think that's important, right? And this is why a lot of people begin to leave Islam, because they encounter people talking about belief. People talk about tawheed. People are talking about, you have to establish the salah. You have to wear hijab. You have to do this. You have to do that. And then the way that they're treated and dealt with is not really reflective of the prophetic example. It's not reflective of who the prophet is. The way that they're talked to, the way that they're treated. And so people see that discrepancy, they see that contradiction. So they end up pulling back. So as Muslims, we have to realize that when we talk about da'wah, when we talk about the whole reality of who we are, we have to constantly be in that mode of building our character. And another quality of the Muslim is to be a person that is conscious of time. Be a person that's conscious of your time. And that makes us very responsible. It makes us understand what our priorities are. It makes us have a sense of goals for the day, for the month, for the year, for our lives. The more we become conscious of time, the more serious we get with things, the more that we're alert to how it is that we're making decisions and what our intentions are. The issue of being conscious of time is a serious one. And then also part of the character of the Muslim, especially focusing on da'wah, is to be beneficial to others. Not just to focus on just your own development and so on and so forth, but learn how to be beneficial to others. And when we work together as a group and we have these similar qualities in our education, then what ends up happening is that we become a community or a group that's beneficial to each other and to others. And we become a group that we're conscious of time. We become a group that we have a foundation in worship that's sound. Like, we're just not practicing making stuff up. We may not be perfect, but at least we have a sense of direction of where we're going in. And then this one is some have, in terms of education for da'wah, some have debated this point. In Arabic, it's called in the qawi al-jism or qawi al-badan. And really here, I've heard a couple different interpretations of this, which means to be a strong Muslim physically. a strong Muslim in body. Some people have just automatically taking it to mean like exercise and so on and so forth. And that's true. That has its basis. That we as Muslims, that we should be in, we should aim for peak performance health. But I've heard another understanding of this characteristic, right? These are characteristics that we should be developing in our persona for the Muslim personality. And what I've heard developed in this is that we should look to see how it is we can develop our potential. It's not just the issue of the issue of strength of the body, but it's the issue of developing our potentials, because all of us have talents, and those talents are like precious stones, and they're like precious metals under the ground. How do you discover precious metals and stones that are buried? You see what I'm saying? They have to be unearthed. They have to be uncovered. They have to be cleaned up. They have to be put in, and that's the same thing with our talents. A lot of us, this is something that we don't talk about as Muslims, right? And this is something that we don't encourage each other to. And it's something that we should, which is to develop our potential, to really look at our lives and see where our strengths are at, and to see how it is that we can develop our potential. The other issue is to be a person of means. Thank you. To be a person that قادر على الاكتساب والكسب. So here the idea is to make sure that, and this is especially important for converts and youth, to ensure that we're growing economically, that we have the ability to sustain ourselves, and we're not just staying stuck. And when we start talking about developing our potential, you know what I'm saying, then we're not going to stay in the average realm. This has to be emphasized for many of us, because what has happened is that a lot of times when we think about practicing Islam, we think about it going against our ability to exert ourselves in the dunya. Or, we talk about dunya as something negative, but that's not correct. You understand what I'm saying? How it is that we live in the dunya can either be positive or negative. Allah is the one that created this world, this temporary time period that we're living in. And it's Allah that put us in this space, and it's very meaningful. It's a meaningful life. And when we talk about having sound belief, this is a very important point. When we talk about correcting our belief, is that we start to have a different view on life, that life itself has goodness in it. Life itself is beautiful. Like, our life is worth something. Our life is valuable. We're accountable for it. You see what I'm saying? If we don't have that type of mindset, then life becomes a burden. Life becomes meaningless. Life becomes dark. You see what I'm saying? And that really is a quality of disbelief. And when we were talking about Sayyid Nursi, this is what Sayyid Nursi was battling, that he wanted to counteract ideas, which are ideas of disbelief or unbelief that have become widespread, you know what I'm saying, amongst the Muslims. And this is one of them, the way that we talk about the world. You understand what I'm saying? We talk about the world like it's an evil place. It's not an evil place. Evil comes from human activity. You understand what I'm saying? Even when it comes to understanding evil in terms of, like, if something happens and we say, well, why did Allah allow evil? Some situations we may interpret them as evil, and they may not necessarily be evil. But when it comes to humans, what humans do in terms of harming each other, in terms of destroying society, you see what I'm saying? Harming themselves. Yeah, this is a form of evil. You understand what I'm saying? That's clear cut. But in the bigger picture, when we talk about a hurricane being like evil, or when we talk about, for instance, sickness being evil, we're not necessarily clear that that's evil or not. And we have some examples even of life situations in the story of Musa and Khidr in the Quran that shows that certain things can be interpreted one way, but in reality there's a wisdom behind it. And how many things in our lives have occurred like that? That in the moment it has been a situation of bitterness or a situation of hardship. And then when we look back, we're like, wow, like I went through the fire with that situation and I suffered, but then what I experienced was a situation in which I experienced a situation in which I took benefit. So that's something that we have to really consider. And so then lastly, to be organized in our affairs. And this is one of the things that we find that we have a difficulty with this. You know what I'm saying? To be organized in our affairs. I'm not sure if everyone can hear. I have one person saying that they can't hear. If other people can't hear, please send us a message. And so those are some of the qualities that we talk that are important when we talk about um, the issue of the character of the Muslim. And then lastly is we didn't mention this before. uh, we There's actually two qualities that we didn't mention, and that is to be self-disciplined spiritually, and to learn how to work with yourself. To learn how to work with yourself. He said, "Mujahidin nafsi." To learn how to work with yourself, and the other one is to be a person of to understand the world that you live in. To become educated about the world you live in, about life itself. You know, to become to develop your cultural standpoint, to understand the world, understand peoples. Understand what's going on in the time period, whether it's science or whether it's the issue of uh, the way that social media impacts, or whether it's the latest development in agriculture, whatever. In other words, live in the time period that you're in, and and really learn what's going on. You know what I'm saying, and be well rounded. Here they call it مثقف الفكر, so that you're educated. In other words, you're educated. So, and the little bit of time that we have left, we wanted to talk a little bit about, when we talk about the issue of developing a sound belief. We wanted to talk about Surah Al-Fatiha, because it is one of those surahs, and we talked about it before, but we wanted to start with it again. It is one of those surahs of the Quran, and which we recite about 17 times a day. Uh, and we take the day and night together as being day. It's a part of the Quran which is oft repeated, is oft recited, is memorized, and is something that we all constantly read, but at times the meaning escapes us. So we started off with some of the meaning, and we said that Surah Al-Fatiha introduces us to the idea that Allah wa Ta'ala is most merciful, most compassionate, or most compassionate, most merciful. Sorry about that. And so that's one understanding. And so when we talk about the idea of Allah wa Ta'ala being a Rahman, some of the scholars say that describes who Allah is. And when we talk about Ar-Rahim, that describes how Allah deals with the creation. That's one position. You understand what I'm saying? And so here we have to realize that in essence, Iman is that. That Iman is that we read life situations in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. In other words, we have Iman, and we have this belief that behind everything that goes on, Allah wa Ta'ala is the one that created, sustains, guides the creation itself by the rules that govern the created order, right? And also by revelation. In other words, when we talk about the knowledge itself for us as Muslims, knowledge itself is not just the issue of the Quran and revelation. We have the book of creation and the book of revelation, and we also have ourselves as books, because the human being is a mini universe. That's how some of the scholars thought about it in the past. The human being is a world unto himself or herself. in terms of, if you look at cameras nowadays and you look at, for instance, how cameras have not caught up to the level of duplicating the eye. The eye is so amazing, so dynamic. The same thing when we talk about, the issue of listening devices in the ear, when we talk about computers in the brain, and so the more that we study the human being, the more we get an understanding that it is impossible for this being that's duplicated multiple people, millions throughout the world, and functions. There's a certain part of us that just functions programmed. Like, once you don't tell yourself to grow hair, you don't tell yourself to grow old, you don't tell yourself to go to sleep. All of that stuff is programmed. There's that part of you that's programmed, and it just flows whether you want to or not. And then there's that part of you where you're making decisions. You see what I'm saying? And so that in itself even speaks to us about the nature of reality. Like, the universe itself, it moves on its own with the command of Allah. But the human being has to be guided. So we're part of the universe. We're not separate from the universe. So we have the sunnah of Allah that governs the physical side of us, and then we have revelation itself, right? The sunnah of Allah is the principles, the commands that Allah, has that govern the created world and reality itself. And then when we talk about our decision making, revelation is where we get guidance from and how to decision make, right? And so ultimately, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is introducing himself to us as a Rahman Rahim. And so then our position is one of praise, is one of glorification and adoration of Allah in a unique way. So when we say Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, we have a spirit of, is more than just thankfulness. We realize that existence itself, that God, that Allah, deserves that, has that right over us to have that mindset. Thankfulness is easy to say that because we use that in English, but here the word hamd is more than just thankfulness. Because thankfulness, the debate that goes on amongst the ulama is like, for instance, if you were to give me this pen, you gave me something. So then now I'm say thank you because you gave me something. But but if I show a sense of just your presence, your presence, I'm like the person's presence, I'm like thankful for that person's presence. You know what I'm saying? I'm thankful for life itself. That's a different mindset. Yeah, that's a different mindset. Then when we move beyond that, just being thankful for life, is like when we acknowledge that comes from Allah, and we're in awe. The same sense of awe, where we're in the sense of just like it's so wonderful. It touches us. It's amazing. Where we're like Alhamdulillah, but then it's not just Alhamdulillah. Here is Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, the one who created, guides, sustains everything, whether seen or unseen, known or unknown, generations of time. This earth had many, many generations of people on it. They go and they come, they go and they come, they go and they come. You see what I'm saying? There's rocks that are older than, a few generations of people. There's rocks that have been here and they've seen civilization, not literally seen, but the point is that those rocks are there. So the created order itself, right? Allah sustains that, and Allah sustains all of that. Allah creates all of that. But now it's not just the issue of creation; it's the issue of the sense that we're not alone. And the non-Muslims, that's where they want to. That's where they cause doubt in that. It's the sense that we're not just here alone. We're not just left abandoned. See what I'm saying? That we're being guided to some purpose. That life again is meaningful. Connecting with that is extremely important. And so then we're reminded again of who is this God, Ar-Rahman. And then now the issue of responsibility comes that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is the one that everything comes back to, Maliki Yawmiddin, meaning that the human being here now is unique in that we have to take account. The human being was given the trust, the amana of free will, of choice. It's limited, of course, because we said part of us, we're on a program, right? We don't have complete freedom, but we have decision making. And so then the idea that we're going to confront the one who really owns all of this, the one who everything, an account of everything has to be given to. And then that's where, we were reminded that this person, this being, subhanAllah, is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, but then now the Quran is calling us and teaching us how to understand. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. After having that understanding, that is you, Allah, that we worship. And who is Allah? The one that is the most compassionate, the most merciful, the one who creates, the one who sustains, the one who guides, the one who not only created the world and it moves by Allah's command, but also the one who sends the prophets to guide us. And in this case, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In this case, the Quran. And then it's not just the issue of worshiping; it's the issue of also knowing that that we're relying on Allah. We're relying on Allah on two fronts: for our sustenance and for our guidance. And then we're asking Allah, "Ihdina siratal mustaqim," guide us to that path. That there's a path, and in other words, there's a way to function on earth. There's a way to maneuver. It's not just guessing. And there's a path that's pleasing, that brings benefit, and a path that doesn't bring benefit. That's how the surah ends. And designating that path of benefit is the path in which Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم. An'amta is the one that your blessings are with them, with that group. Al-Ghadab or Al-Maghdubi is those who have incurred Allah's anger. And there's a hadith that says it's the people of the book, but usually when it comes to the issue of the Quran, we also have to realize that the meanings of the Quran go beyond it. So that could be us as well. We can be on Allah's anger list. And then the صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. And so here we can be well intended, but we can function without knowledge. That's where we can be astray in that regard. You see what I'm saying? We can be well intended, but without knowledge. So we can have knowledge and not practice it. And that's the balance that we're in. And that's why it's always important for us to ask ourselves, what it is that we're doing, and to seek guidance from Allah and seek help, and to realize that we have limitations. Right? And so when we talk about Surah Al-Fatiha, or in the shade of Surah Al-Fatiha, or in the shade of the Quran in this case, by way of Surah Al-Fatiha, Surah Al-Fatiha has given us this idea that we're not alone in the world, and that we're not by ourselves, and also that we should be moving as a community. Because when we say ihdina, guide us. When we say iyyaka na'budu, when we say that it is you that we worship Allah, right? We're saying that as a group. You know what I'm saying? So there's no doubt that that is an important process, and that's really where a lot of people are breaking down. A lot of people are breaking down because they're functioning as individuals, and then when you function solely as an individual and out of a relationship with others, it's also hard to relate to Allah. That's testing and challenging when you don't feel love from people, when you don't feel support from people. See what I'm saying? Iman, part of it is that the Prophet ﷺ, nowhere in the stages of Dawah is he just leaving people to just move on their own. You just go figure it out by yourself. You come back to me when you feel like it, you know what I'm saying? And let me know how you're doing. No, from every stage you find that the Prophet ﷺ is guiding the people until they're able to, be as a community. As a community. You understand what I'm saying? And that's the challenge. That was the challenge, is how do you bring about change in a society in which the people are self-imploding and destroying each other, so that it's a society in which people are loving and helpful? Or how do you become part of a society, like in the case of the Muslims when they went to Africa, to Ethiopia? How do you become part of a society where you necessarily don't believe in everything that they believe in, like in Ethiopia, that was a Christian society, but you have a common ground? You understand what I'm saying? How do you function in that place? Right? So the most important thing that we see is the qualities, the conditions of life. Some conditions of life encourage the deen or encourage the values of the deen, and some conditions of life or some environments it just clashes too much. It goes against that, and this human life in general, as well. So with that, inshallah, we end, and we'll regroup next week, inshallah.